Ooh! Hey there, lifting legends. Welcome back to another pumped up episode of Muscle and Feels, the podcast that's all about combining edgy humor with lifting science.
That's right, Milo. We're your hosts, Milo and Pac, and we're here to dissect the gym world with a touch of humor and a dash of science.
And today, folks, we've got a juicy episode for you. We're diving deep into the latest study by Helms et al., titled Effect of Small and Large Energy Surpluses on Strength, Muscle, and Skin Fold Thicknesses. Ooh, sounds fancy, doesn't it?
It sure does, Milo. But don't worry, we're here to break it down in a way that even your grandma can understand. R.I.P. Plus, we'll throw in some humor to keep those weights from feeling too heavy.
Absolutely, Pac. This study is a game changer in the world of bulking, and you don't want to miss it. We'll be discussing the nitty-gritty details, what it means for your gains, and of course, our own personal experiences with bulking.
And don't forget, folks, Milo and I are more than just lifting buddies. We're prominent researchers in the evidence-based fitness world, and, well, we're also lovers.
That's right, Pac. So you know, you're getting the best of both worlds, science and love, in every episode.
So grab your protein shake, get comfy, and let's dive into this episode on bulking with a side of laughter, love, and science. It's going to be a wild ride. Outro music.
Thanks for tuning in to Muscle and Feels, where lifting meets laughs.
Yeah, that's the outro, actually. This is catch you on the flip side, gym warriors. Peace. Thank you for listening. All right.
What was that, Pac? What the fuck did we just do? That was horrible. I hated this.
That was a ChatGPT generated intro with the prompt being introduce the Muscle and Feels podcast episode on bulking. Muscle and Feels is an edgy humor lifting podcast focused on gym and science. The episode you're introducing is on the latest study by Helms et al. Titled, and the title, the hosts of the podcast are called Milo and Pac, two prominent researchers and lovers in the world of evidence-based fitness. Extreme High was like, okay, gotta now say every sentence has to say science, edgy,
I took the
humor.
prompt and just introduced the podcast to a listener, but being very self-flattering. Being like, your favorite funny podcast.
Muscle and Feels, we back. Let's
back in the trap house.
Back in the trap house
center.
We're cooking crack today, live with
10:30 p.m. unshowered, fresh from the gym.
That's true.
You can smell it from your home.
Yes, and I'm literally wearing a diaper. No cap, but that said,
Keep it real.
Keep it real. We gotta balance out the cringe. The cringe.
It felt like it was on and no disrespect to Americans, on an American radio show.
Wow.
But like one from like the 60s.
That's broadcasted live from your own country. This is who they let in. This is what ESTA has done to your country.
Bro.
I mean, we did wait for an hour at Passport, so you've earned it. Enjoy.
That's what you get. You hear me?
Milo Wolf.
We coming.
Drinking your Fairlife milk, which is difficult to find. And also taking your, making fun of your...
Culture.
TV shows, yeah, culture. Cool. We back though, and we are looking at this study. Now, the world of bulking is a funny world.
As the introduction said, you know, it's a very funny podcast.
It's true. And it's crazy how it's like, here to shake the bulking world. But to an extent it is, although, because it was a really cool study. But at the same time, let's just take a few steps back and talk about the magical world of bulking. So, yeah, from eat big to get big, suggestions by bodybuilders, articles, and so on and so forth, and just the saying in general being out there, to literally having motivational YouTube videos on eating motivation, and no cap, and that's how.
Have you ever watched one of those? Like actually, unironically, because I have.
And ironically, no. I'm a fatso. I don't need to watch eating motivation.
Unironically once when I was bulking and I was about 250 pounds maybe.
Wow.
And I was scoffing down the last like half a pound to a pound of rice for the day. And I needed everything I could get at that point.
Bro, this is a guy that does a lot of these. One of them is called Eat Like a Monster, all caps. Eat Like a Monster, bulking for max growth, how bodybuilders eat motivation, and it has 14 million views.
And it's a picture of Jay Cutler eating out of a Tupperware container. So, proceed.
Okay, cool. So, yeah, growing up as lifters, especially being coming up at around 2013, when the world of evidence-based fitness was somewhat coming up, and bulking and cycles of intense bulking and cutting were a thing. And you'd always see a picture of like either Lee Priest or Jay Cutler or even Ronnie Coleman at some points. There are a few classic pictures of those bodybuilders. The one is with Lee Priest holding his belly, no pump, no nothing, and looking absolutely obese. Well, obviously he still looks like he has a lot of muscle on him, but he does look unhealthy. In that picture, there's a classic picture of Jay Cutler as well, where he was, I think, sitting on a table where he also looks like 400 pounds, and a few of Ronnie Coleman. And the idea that committing to a very long and relatively aggressive bulk, where you're gaining a bunch of fat and you are becoming humongous, but not necessarily humongous for muscle, is necessary to absolutely facilitate the best muscle growth possible. And gaining fat in the winter and then stripping it off in the summer is a necessary process that needs to take place. But the fat gain was sort of viewed, but the almost extreme fat gain, or at least significant fat gain, was viewed as a necessary evil in the process of gaining muscle. Keep in mind that a lot of the anecdotes that were used were based on high-level, elite, genetic freak bodybuilders on PEDs who, got fat, but because they were on PEDs and had elite genetics as well, gained fat, but gained a lot of muscle too. And then because again they were on PEDs and had elite genetics, it was relatively, I'm not going to say easy to get on Olympia level conditioning, but for sure to lose a bunch of that fat and still look pretty lean and bigger.
For sure. I do think Lee Priest has always been the poster child for big to get big.
It's the classic one. With he did like a KFC, sort of like it's him eating KFC or some shit. And I actually saw Lee Priest live when I was 18 or 19. He had a seminar in Southampton.
Spartan's Gym?
Spartan's Gym. Shout out to the old school version of Spartan's Gym. And we went and I was like, nice, he's a pro bodybuilder. I can ask him so many things. And I asked something along the lines of, what's the main difference in like approaching training if you're on PEDs or you are natural? And he was like, just train hard in it. Like something as vague as that, which in hindsight, that's the case.
Quite based.
But at the same time, I expected something like, when I got on PEDs, recovery improved so much, I upped my volume, I changed this, I changed that, but the guy was literally like just lifting and eating.
So we've gone from Lee Priest offering you arguably correct advice to now having to do studies on bulking.
Studies, cringe. But let's now talk about how the pendulum has not entirely swung, but from the YOLO bulk days and it's bulking season, let's get fat, we went to lean gains, conservative surpluses, and then for some people it went even as far as just maintenance calories. So Greg Doucette is a big proponent of like super slow phases of bulking or something.
Main gaining.
Jeff Nibbert has made a video on that, but it's not like he's like promoting it. He's just talked about the idea of main gaining. We've talked about it for sure, but things have somewhat changed. Although bros that are not in our echo chambers are still bulking and hoping to turn fat into muscle or whatever else people would say back in the day.
For sure. So we have 3 studies by my count on bulking. The most recent one was performed by Eric Helms and colleagues, as was nicely introduced by ChatGPT. Do you want to start breaking it down?
Sure. Shall we? We can start with the Helm study. We can also, fuck it. We will start with the Helm study and then talk about other studies before that.
Like the Gorth paper and the
Murphy.
Smith paper. No, Murphy is the meta-regression, I believe.
Yeah. You're going to talk about individual studies?
Yeah. Okay. So there's 3 studies looking at the effects of different surpluses on gains in muscle mass. So essentially, looking at what is the effect of having a smaller versus larger surplus on and how fast you gain weight on how much muscle you gain, right? So this most recent study by Helms and colleagues had 3 groups. One group was intended to just maintain their body weight. So they got a guidance from a dietitian and they were instructed to just essentially aim to maintain their weight as determined by a familiarization phase. The second group was aiming to be in a 5% calorie surplus. So whatever their maintenance was, they would eat 5% above that maintenance.
Are you a mathematician?
I am. 5%, 6%.
R.I.P. Rich
I could
Piana.
go on.
The Rich Piana study.
5%ers.
And the third group, 15% over maintenance.
Correct. So if your maintenance is 3,000 calories, quick math, for 5% surplus, that's 150 calorie surplus. For a 15% surplus, that's a 450 calorie surplus.
When you started the calculation, my brain they all just went into like audience mode. They didn't even try. All the little packs in my head, they're like, just listen to him, we're not going to try.
You're not going to try and do the math yourself. It's cool. Now,
how about the participants?
The participants were well-trained individuals, relatively well-trained. They all benched and squatted well over their body weight, which by research standards, pretty well-trained.
Pretty well-trained.
In all likelihood, for most beginner intermediates listening to this, about the same level as you are. So relatively well-trained. Not Ronnie Coleman, but relatively well-trained.
Yeah. The study was 8 weeks long. Participants were also consuming plenty of protein, so roughly 1.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And they were also instructed to eat 3 to 5 meals spread evenly throughout the day with at least 20 grams of protein per meal. So essentially they tried to keep the study as ecologically valid as you would in the world of lifting. And they also obviously lifted.
For sure. And when you're talking about the 5% surplus versus the 15% surplus, those surpluses were aimed towards gaining about 0.5% of body weight for the 5% group per month. So if you weigh 200 pounds, it's about £1 a month. And for the 15% surplus group, that would be aiming to gain about 1.5% of body weight per month. So if we weigh 200 pounds, again, that's about £3 per month. The training program was 3 days a week, using mostly compounds like the squat, the bench press, the pull down, some dumbbell rows, some dumbbell shoulder pressing, some curls, etc. What's worth noting in here is that most exercises, or most muscle groups rather, were trained with around 10 sets a week. However, the one outlier here is the biceps. For the biceps, if you count the work from pull downs, and there is actually a study looking at bicep growth and pull downs, suggesting that pull downs are actually pretty solid for bicep growth. So if you count...
Mike Menzer said it as well.
Shit, he got another thing right, you know? Mike Menzer was talking
Nostradamus.
about this. Indeed. So if you count the pull down volume, the rowing volume, and the curling volume, overall the biceps are actually getting about 17 sets a week of relatively good training, right? So the biceps were probably the muscle group being trained the most effectively out of any muscle group in this study.
For sure. Keep in mind also that training was supervised, which was somewhat cool, because this wasn't a training study per se. And let's also talk about what they measured. So they measured squat and bench 1RM strength, and then they assessed body fat by
skin fold.
So I was thinking the word thickness in my head, and that was carried out by an ISAC certified
skin fold caliper technician.
Yeah, anthropometrist actually, for the triceps, biceps, subscapular, iliac crest, abdominal, front thigh, and medial.
Mid-axillary.
Huh?
Mid-axillary? No?
No?
I don't know, something like that. Anyway, 7 sides skin fold.
7 sides.
7 or 9? That's a good question, but it doesn't really matter, is the answer. So I think it's 7 side in this case, but essentially a relatively valid, and in this case likely reliable, measurement of body fat as a result of being performed by an ISAC certified anthropometrist.
Greek word. It's funny how we went into that detail where we could have just said what we said, and that would have been fine.
What about muscle thicknesses though? Did you mention?
No, I didn't.
So muscle thickness of the quads and the biceps, I believe, was measured.
Yes,
Quads, biceps, and triceps, actually. So, as I mentioned earlier, keep in mind throughout the interpretation that the biceps were being trained the most effectively out of any of the muscle groups involved. So, what did they find?
Whoa.
Putting you on the spot here.
No, I'm joking. They found that essentially there were no overall gains were similar among the conditions. Actually, the group that, as you pointed out to me the other day, both surplus groups were on a similar surplus rather than the same surplus. So they were on a more aggressive surplus, closer to the 15% surplus, even though they weren't.
How do we know?
Because of their body weight gain.
So both the 5% surplus group and the 15% surplus group actually ended up gaining similar amounts of weight pre to post. So while this study was intended to be a comparison of different surpluses, in reality, it kind of ended up being a comparison of maintenance to a relatively aggressive surplus.
Yeah. And we also know that the maintenance group truly maintained their weight because they maintained their weight, which was super cool to see. Obviously, keep in mind that a nutrition study of this caliber, in order for you to carry it out with absolute precision and control, they would literally have to be doing that in a clinical ward, and have people live there and provide all their food and control their activity and so on and so forth. So
That's not gonna happen.
it is, but at least we have the data shows that the participants gained weight. So we are for sure comparing maintenance to two different, two surplus groups essentially.
Yeah.
Amazing. The gains were similar, although the groups that were eating in the surplus gained more bicep size. Although that change favoring the higher surplus groups was somewhat trivialish.
Yeah. So by and large, changes in squat nerve max, in bench nerve max, in tricep thickness, quad thickness, they were all pretty similar between groups. If you had to kind of squint your eyes just right, you would see that the bulk groups, like the groups gaining weight, did generally see slightly more favorable outcomes, but we're not talking about a 9-day difference here. Even the maintenance group saw solid gains in their one-rep maxes, in their muscle size, even while just maintaining body weight. So if you're someone who doesn't want to gain weight, and you're not in a complete edge case, like let's say for example you're 5% body fat, yeah, maintaining your body weight isn't going to optimize your growth, right? But if you're someone who's at a reasonable body fat percentage and you're not super well trained and you're okay with getting pretty good gains and not the best gains possible, you will still make solid gains being at maintenance. Is basically the long and short here. However, while most measurements didn't really favor the surplus groups, the one measurement that did favor the surplus group was the bicep thickness measurement. Now, as I pointed out earlier, the biceps were also the muscle group receiving the most adequate training, or the most productive training potentially, with 17 sets per week. One hypothesis that you can form around this finding within the study is that the higher your proclivity for muscle gain, based on the situation, you're a beginner, you're on PEDs, you have great sleep, you have low stress. Essentially, the more favorable your conditions for muscle growth are, the more you potentially benefit from a surplus and potentially from a larger surplus. Now, it's not a hypothesis I'm super confident in because we're talking about one measurement within the study here. None of the other measurements really showed any sort of trend like that besides this one. And it wasn't an overwhelmingly clear finding. It's not like there was a huge difference between the maintenance group and the surplus groups in bicep thickness.
Yeah.
But there was a slight difference in favor of the surplus groups.
Yeah, and we must also interpret the results of the study with some caution, but given that, it was only, I think, 5 to 6 participants per group, because a few people dropped out, and this was done also through the COVID. Shout out COVID. But because, as with every study, and as Milo said, now you can look at the study, make an educated guess or a hypothesis, but as with every other study, we have to view it in light of the totality of current available evidence, which we will do, and that evidence supports the notion that you can still make gains on maintenance calories. But one thing that we haven't mentioned and is crucial is that although there were no major differences as far as strength and hypertrophy goes among the groups, the group that gained the most weight, the group that ate in the high surplus also gained the highest amount of body fat. So essentially, YOLO bulking and gaining a bunch of body fat will likely result to you gaining just more fat without necessarily making a bunch more muscle gains.
You hit it on the head. You hit the nail on the head.
I was seeing you scrolling up and down, and my eyes were going up and down. My eyes are up here, I'm telling myself. So, just to view this in the context of the rest of the literature, we're going to look at another couple of individual studies and then just briefly go over a meta-analysis that didn't look at bulking, but rather at calorie deficits and how they affect muscle growth. But within that study, you can also see that people on maintenance calories essentially made gains. Spoiler alert, I mean, that's that for that study.
That's the episode. Peace.
But yeah, so we have another study by Garth et al. Shout out, Ina.
This study has been spoken about exclusively by Eric Helms. I remember every bulking podcast episode he's ever been on for any podcast ever. He'd be like, we actually have a very cool study by Garth and colleagues.
He's awesome.
Until relatively recently, I actually hadn't read that study. So I was like, yep, the one study by Garth and colleagues, let's go.
Shout out Garth.
Shout out Ina Garth.
Ina Garth.
So, in this study, this is what happened. 39 athletes were randomized.
Elite athletes,
in fact. Were randomized to one of two groups. One group received nutritional counseling, and where they kind of aimed to have them gain weight at a certain pace. Whereas another group, they were instructed to eat ad libitum, just aiming to be in a slight surplus, essentially. So, what happened? Well, the group, and they both lifted consistently over 8 to 12 weeks. So this wasn't just a random study where people ate in a surplus, they were also lifting consistently. Essentially what happened was the ad libitum group, the group just being told to eat in a surplus, but eat as per hunger, gained less body weight compared to the group receiving nutritional counseling. In fact, if I recall correctly, I'm going off the top of my head here.
You are recalling correctly.
It's the nutritional counseling group gained about 2% of body weight per month, whereas the other group gained about closer to just under 1% per month. So we're talking about those sorts of rate of weight gain. And here's what happened.
How much did you say for the nutrition counseling group?
Gained about 2% of body weight per month if you average it over the course of the 8 to 12 weeks.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because I was looking at the total numbers.
No, I think that's correct. So what happened? Well, one finding that was broadly publicized, and in fact I even made a video about this on my channel, is that the group eating the larger surplus, so the nutritional counseling, gained 5 times as much fat as the group eating ad libitum. While that is technically true, it was also a difference between gaining 200 grams of body fat over the study versus 1.1 kilograms of body fat over the study. So yes, it's over a 5-fold difference, but you're also talking about a difference of less than a kilogram or less than 2 pounds of fat gain over 8 to 12 weeks.
Yeah.
So it's the sort of thing that if you watch the news, for example, you'll often hear, oh, eating bacon increases your risk of cancer by 80% or something. And it's like, yeah, it's an increase of 80% relative to a very low risk to begin with.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the difference between relative risks and absolute risks.
1.5 kilos is average sushi dinner.
And the average sushi dinner with Brad.
Shout out.
Shout out, Brad.
So just to look at some of the specifics here, because it's important to mention how much the participants weighed and so on and so forth. Keep in mind these were elite athletes, and the people in the group that received counseling started at around 70 kilos and they ended up at around 73 kilos. They gained about 2.7 kilos of body weight. The group that did not receive counseling started at around 75 kilos and ended up at around 76 kilos. So overall, even though the headline on like a fitness sort of evidence-based news page would be, they gained all this weight and using potentially like a 5-fold difference as part of the title, we're talking about individuals that visually it's quite possible that you wouldn't really even notice that weight change. So this is not necessarily a study where bodybuilders went from 80 kilos to 100 kilos in the off season and got super fat. That doesn't change how we apply the results, but just throwing it out there. As far as their fat mass goes, the group that received counseling started at 7.3 kilos and then ended up at 8.4, and the group that didn't receive counseling started at 10.3 and ended up at essentially the same, aka 10.5. So they didn't gain much fat.
For sure. A couple of things I think get overlooked about the study. Number one, while these were elite athletes, if you actually look at their strength, it wasn't anything crazy. Right?
No.
Like their 1 rep max on the bench was about 80 to 85 kilograms on average. Now obviously there's some female athletes and there's some male athletes, so there's going to be some differences there. And likewise, their squats are about in the 120 kilogram range, so nothing crazy by most lifter standards. But just to note that they're probably not the most resistance trained athletes ever, but they are definitely in most people's estimations early intermediates or intermediates.
Yeah, and that's somewhat reflected, I guess, by their progress as well.
For sure. And the final thing I want to mention is they also measured counter movement jump height and 40-meter sprint speed, essentially. And the group bulking faster did see essentially their vertical jump and their sprints get worse from pre to post.
Yeah.
Whereas the group gaining weight more slowly actually saw an improvement or maintenance or improvement in both. So if you're someone who is competing in a different sport, and like let's say for example jumping or sprint speed are important in your sport, this might be an indication that, hey, unless you have a good reason to, maybe you don't gain weight so fast that it's going to come at the detriment of your other abilities within the sport.
And just for whatever cool info's sake, the athletes there was one athlete that was a rowing athlete, one was a kayaking athlete, 4 soccer athletes, 1 volleyball athlete, 1 taekwondo athlete, 5 skating athletes, and 26 ice hockey athletes. But they got tested at an Olympic center, which...
Honestly though, if you hadn't told me about that 1 kayaking athlete, not sure how I would have slept in. So I appreciate that.
But I could already see the criticism. Yeah, ice hockey athletes. Cool.
Ice hockey athletes actually do lift. I have a client who is an ice hockey player, and you gotta be jacked playing ice hockey. Anyways, what about the lean body mass? We didn't even touch on the muscle mass.
Yes.
You just moved to the sports.
We didn't because there was a few different breakdowns of fat-free mass, and I was like, that's too much
We
really.
can just touch on the total lean body mass. I'm not sure there's a difference between upper body versus lower
Isn't
body.
there?
Is there not?
I bet there's been some sort of a speculation around bulking and
Maybe. Anyways, to briefly break down the research and the results here, essentially what happened is by gaining weight much faster in the nutritional counseling group, they saw an increase in lean body mass of 1.7 kilograms. Meanwhile, when they were eating ad libitum, they gained 1.2 kilograms of lean body mass. So we're talking about a roughly 50% difference in lean body mass gained that favored the more aggressive bulking group. Now, again, 50% can seem like a big deal, right? Like you make 1.5 times the gains, but we're again talking about a 500 gram difference in lean body mass gained. So this study to me kind of reads as a wash for relatively slower versus relatively faster rates of weight gain, in the sense that, yes, they gain more muscle mass when gaining weight at about 2% per month. However, they also gained about 5 times the fat, which again, doesn't really mean much. They essentially, although when you draw that out across a long enough time frame, that can start to mean something, right? So here we're talking about 10 weeks, so yeah, it's a kilogram of fat mass gain more, who gives a shit? However, when we're talking about a bulking phase of 6 to 9 months, and you're talking about 6 to 9 kilograms, or not 6 to 9, but like 4 to 5 extra kilograms of fat mass gained over 6 to 9 months, then that can mean curtailing your overall bulk by several months.
Yep.
And then any difference in muscle mass gained, as in this study, gaining about 50% more lean body mass, would be washed out by the fact that you could have been bulking for longer had you been gaining weight at a slower pace, gaining less fat, and being able to bulk more sustainably.
yeah, which I guess the implications of that would be better health in the long term, potentially less time then spent in a deficit, which, as we will touch on in a sec, more aggressive deficits can result in muscle loss and at least impairing muscle gains heavily. And there's quite a few people out there that after the YOLO bulk, they will always go super aggressive because they're like, okay, I'm too fat now. So yeah, totally agree with you there.
For sure. So overall for this study, I see it as somewhat of a wash as far as if you're someone trying to gain muscle and you're not too unhappy to cut in the long term, whether you gain weight a little bit faster, say up to 2% per month, or a bit more slowly, say around 1% a month, doesn't make a huge difference, as long as you're willing to cut earlier or later, depending on whether you bulk faster or more slowly. So that's how I view that study. Now, there is a third study on the topic of bulking and different surpluses, and that was a study conducted by Smith and colleagues.
The infamous. So opening that study up.
So the third study by Smith and colleagues didn't actually have different groups. What happened was, it wasn't an RCT. They just gave all participants a supplement, like a mass gaining supplement, that was geared towards having participants in the surplus, right? So essentially they established their maintenance and then just gave them a supplement trying to get them to gain weight. And what they then did during the study is they kept lifting, they had a program. The authors then analyzed how much muscle mass they gained and how much strength they gained as a function of how much body weight they gained. What did they find? Well, for lean body mass, they found that up to about 2% of body weight gain per month, all body weight gains were lean body mass. So actually, if you gain less than 2% of body weight per month, you saw recomp. So not only did you gain exclusively muscle mass as the extra weight you gained, but you actually lost fat mass as well during the process. So overall, you recomped when you were gaining weight at a pretty slow pace. These differences and these benefits of bulking faster weren't necessarily seen for all metrics of muscle hypertrophy. So when you looked at, for example, the thickness of elbow flexors and the thickness of knee extensors, this change wasn't super consistent. So in the elbow flexors, for example, they saw that hypertrophy decreased as the rate of weight gain increased. Whereas for the knee extensors, hypertrophy increased as the rate of weight gain increased. So I wouldn't take this study as a super consistent win for faster rates of weight gain, that you should just, turbo bulk your way to victory. But there is some indication that you can gain at a relatively faster pace, especially in relatively less trained lifters. So in this case, the athletes were not super well trained. For strength, on the other hand, most of the time, the findings were positive in favor of gaining weight at a decent pace, which is kind of in contrast to the study by Helms and colleagues, where strength findings were largely the same whether you were at maintenance or whether you were in a relatively aggressive surplus. So overall, when you take these three studies together, you find that there is definitely support for the idea that bulking does increase hypertrophy. In the Garth study, they saw about 50% greater hypertrophy being at a pretty aggressive 2% per month rate of weight gain. In the Helms and colleagues study, again, most findings were null, aka whether you maintained or gained weight didn't seem to influence hypertrophy much, but there was one finding in favor of gaining weight, which was in the biceps. And finally, the study by Smith and colleagues here did find that overall, as far as muscle mass gain went, you did see a positive relationship between how fast did you gain weight and how much muscle did you gain overall. So when you look at these three studies together, you do see that gaining weight helps with muscle hypertrophy, and that gaining weight up to 2% of body weight per month does seem to likely increase hypertrophy to an extent. However, what we also know from the Smith and colleagues paper and from the Garth and colleagues paper is that there can be pretty drastic trade-offs with fat gain as well. So when you're going from 1% of body weight gain per month to 2% of body weight gain per month, for example, in the Garth study, you see a 5-fold increase in how much fat mass is gained. Whether or not that's a trade-off worth making kind of comes down to you, how often you're willing to cut, whether cutting is something you're even willing to do. For some people I coach, for example, they don't really ever want to cut. Their lifestyle isn't conducive to it.
When did you coach me?
True. So that's just a trade-off worth making, and when it comes down to should you gain weight at a faster pace or a slower pace, to a good extent, it goes beyond just what is the best strategy to gain muscle now, and it goes more towards what are your preferences for body fat, right? Do you have a certain aesthetic preference? If, for example, you want to stay leaner year-round, you may want to bulk more slowly. If your lifestyle is such that cutting is actually quite difficult, maybe you want to bulk slower so you don't have to cut as often, or maybe you even just want to maintain so you don't ever really need to cut, right? And finally, health risk tolerance. Although it is overblown, there is likely such a thing as too high of a body fat percentage to be in optimal health. And that's generally above 20-22% body weight fat for men. So,
and you could make the point that the more time you spend going up and down in body weight and less time spent maintaining or being close to your maintenance weight, the more difficult it will become over time to essentially, because eventually you'll have to just maintain your body weight, because that will be the end of your gains journey, or at least you'll have a family or whatever. You could make that point as well.
The final finding I would say from this overall data is that for strength it may be a bit more beneficial to be in the large surplus, at least based on the study by Smith and colleagues. And the final thing is, it seems that potentially, and this is not necessarily the case, But it does seem like in the studies where more trained athletes are being used, like for example in the Helms study, and where the conditions for muscle gain were better, like for example for the biceps in the Helms study, whenever those conditions for muscle growth are favorable, there is a larger benefit seen from a larger surplus.
Yeah.
So potentially what this could mean, and this is somewhat more speculative, is that for beginners, for example, gaining weight at a faster pace, A, will sometimes not result in as much fat gain and will result in relatively lean gains, and B, may just be more favorable as a beginner than it is for an advanced training.
Yeah.
So I think as a broad recommendation from this, for beginners, gaining weight at maybe 1 to 2% of body weight per month is a great place. And for a more advanced trainee, or a trainee whose conditions for muscle growth are less favorable, maybe closer to 1% per month is a really good spot to be.
Yeah. And I would also place this point forth against being very aggressively pro main gaining as your sole option. If you're a natty athlete who is spending a lot of time in the gym and a lot of your efforts go towards building muscle, making that bet on the surplus and being in a slight surplus to ensure that you're you're maximizing hypertrophy, I think that slight fat gain that you can easily mitigate for with just like a few weeks of cutting makes sense, especially if you're at a very healthy body fat percentage and you have plenty of inches of space on your waistline as far as health goes. You're not looking at many negatives, if you just gain a few kilos of body fat over a very long period of time while being physically active and engaging in resistance training.
For sure. Equally, the good news from these studies is that you can still absolutely make gains while at maintenance.
Yeah.
And this overall point is actually driven home by another study, and this is a meta-analysis by Murphy and colleagues.
Shout out Murphy and colleagues. Essentially, they looked at how energy deficiency, so being in an energy deficit, impacts gains, and they saw that after, let's say, 500 calories or roughly 500 calories of a deficit, people started losing gains. But if you look into the study and you actually look at the energy deficit, and the closer you get to zero, the better things get for muscle gain.
And even into a surplus. Actually, it doesn't quite go into the surplus, that's my mistake.
Yeah.
However, you do see that even with a 200 to 300 calorie deficit, you can still make gains in your lean body mass.
Yeah.
So there's this idea that you can't make gains at maintenance. You also can't make gains on the cut. You're just fighting to maintain. Well, depending on how fast you cut, that may or may not be true.
Yeah.
It's essentially all on a spectrum, just like Pac and I are. So just keep in mind that if you're bulking very slowly, that won't be that different from when you're maintaining. When you're losing weight very slowly, that also won't be very different from maintaining or gaining weight slowly. It's all on the spectrum from aggressively bulking and being in a good condition for muscle growth, but also gaining a bunch of fat, to aggressively cutting and being in pretty poor condition for muscle growth, but losing lots of fat as well.
Yep.
So a few interesting findings from this overall meta-regression. In total, there were about 60 studies included in some of these analyses. With the meta-regression, lean body mass was maintained at around a 500 calorie deficit. Now, one caveat there is that it does likely depend on your body weight a little bit, right? If you weigh 100 pounds, a 500 calorie deficit can actually be a rate of weight loss of 1% per week. That's a pound loss per week, which is 1% of your body weight. Mm-hmm. That's actually a pretty aggressive cut. Whereas if you're 300 pounds, a 500 calorie deficit may be substantially lower than what you can tolerate without losing muscle. So that's a big consideration there.
Yeah. What I wanted to add is that definitely don't nocebo yourself when you're in a cut, as far as, because what you said actually reminded me of a lot of discussions around maintaining muscle mass when entering a cut, where people, even if they're on a conservative cut, their mindset shifts immediately from I'm gaining muscle to now I'm literally, like if I miss a session, I'm going to be losing muscle because I'm on this deficit.
Yeah, I do think this meta-regression was useful also for a long time, a rate of weight loss has always been like, you can lose weight really fast. Some people say you can lose weight really fast and not lose muscle.
Yeah.
And there's even this camp of relatively evidence-based people that advocate for rapid fat loss, or like protein-spared modified fasting, right? Yeah. And based on this data, I'm just increasingly not convinced.
Yeah, that, and there was another study that we briefly touched on before the podcast recording started. And if you're actually, spying on us like a proper fan of the podcast should, so unless you're not here hiding in these cupboards, one, you're not a real fan, and two, there was another study that looked that was called low energy availability reduces myofibrillar and sarcoplasmic muscle protein synthesis in trained females. Essentially took a bunch of trained females, as the title implies. One group was consuming maintenance calories, so they didn't change their calories whatsoever, around 2,400 calories. The other group went on a 1,000 calorie deficit, and just after 10 days, the group that was on the YOLO calorie deficit, not only they lost a bunch of fat, for sure, they lost around 2 kilos of fat, but they also saw a decrease in muscle mass, nitrogen balance, some blood biomarkers, resting metabolic rate, and muscle protein synthesis. This was a really cool study because they also supervised their training, provided their food. It was really well controlled, and essentially a big deficit, although they were consuming plenty of protein and resistance training. So as far as ecological validity goes and having like a relatively optimized aggressive calorie scenario, they had it. They trained, they did cardio as well, ate plenty of protein, and they were trained athletes. And in just 10 days, things got pretty fucked up as far as overall gains go.
Yep. And with a 1,000 calorie deficit in females that on average, I assume weighed
60 kilos, 63.
60 kilos, that is a large deficit. That's going to result in losing about just over a kilo a week, which is like 1.5% of body weight per week. So when you're losing weight that fast, in all likelihood, if it's 1.5% a week, and in 10 days they lost 2 kilograms, that makes sense.
Yeah, and they were consuming they also had a control group as well. No, actually, I'm chatting shit. No, that was scratch that. They were consuming around 100 grams of protein each. So
they were meeting the 1.6 times body weight guideline.
For sure.
They were at least having that.
Well,
even with resistance training, even with an adequate protein intake, being in a 1,000 calorie deficit or losing much more than like 1% at the most of body weight per week is going to be a rough time. So I think this kind of overall blends in quite nicely with the meta-regression by Murphy and colleagues, where you do see that much past 500 calories deficit per day, you start potentially losing muscle.
Yeah, just one small side note, because I think it's somewhat important. There were no significant differences at baseline for either of the groups in the trained female study, as far as muscle mass went, training experience, strength, fat mass, or even age and height and weight. So, because I can see some people thinking, okay, maybe one group was super lean and the other group was fatter, therefore things worked out better for the fatter group. But yeah, huge energy deficit, probably bad news.
For sure. So we even touched on losing weight.
We fucking killed it on this episode. I had to curse to get demonetized. So yeah, we don't need your money, YouTube. We don't want your money.
We'll only take our loyal subscribers' PayPal money. And don't forget to smash that bell down below.
Smash that like button and subscribe and send us money. And we'll see you all at the next episode of Muscle and Feels coming
soon.
Peace.